It's an enormous privilege and pleasure for us that Stefan Herbrechter has very kindly agreed to give our first keynote at this conference, Posthumanism and the Posthuman, Chances and Challenges in German and European Literature and Culture. And I don't need to remind this audience, certainly, that almost as soon as one ventures into the realm of the posthuman, one comes across Stefan's name in all sorts of different contexts, and especially perhaps in the context of contemporary critical posthumanism, in whose development he's played an integral role. Stefan is currently an independent scholar and Privatdozent affiliated with the University of Heidelberg in Germany. He was previously reader in cultural theory and director of postgraduate studies in media at Coventry University until 2014. And before that, he was professor of English and cultural studies at Heidelberg. Having decided to leave the traditional structures of academia behind, he now describes himself in his bio on his excellent website, I have to say, stefanherbrechter.com, as a post-academic, with that post having, I believe, not dissimilar resonances to the post in poststructuralism and indeed, funnily enough, posthumanism. And his involvement in the development of critical posthumanism goes all the way back to his time as a PhD student in critical and cultural theory at Cardiff University, which at the time was the epicenter of so-called British poststructuralism, which of course was a very French thought-inflected affair. And that was the context within which a group of scholars, including Neil Badmington and Ivan Kallas, and Stefan himself, of course, developed their critical approach to posthumanism as what Stefan on his website calls the ongoing deconstruction of humanism. He's currently director of the Critical Posthumanisms Network and general editor of Brill's Critical Posthumanisms book series, for which you'll find a flyer in the virtual conference pack. He's also the author and editor of numerous influential books around the themes of posthumanism and the posthuman, including the excellent Posthumanism, A Critical Analysis in 2013, which came out with Bloomsbury, his co-edited Palgrave Handbook of Critical Posthumanism, which I believe came out last year.
Yeah, just about.
Excellent. And the intriguingly titled Before Humanity, Posthumanism and Ancestrality, which also appeared, I believe, last year with Brill. So in short, Stefan's work has been integral to the contemporary development of critical posthumanism in response to some of the philosophical shortcomings, perhaps, of humanist and transhumanist thought and ideology. Once again, it's an immense privilege to have you here today, Stefan, to talk to us. And would you all join me in welcoming Stefan, who'll be talking to us about posthumanism's German genealogies.
Great, many thanks. Generous introduction. Thanks for the invitation to the conference team for all the hard work. And I think it's been a pleasure so far. And I hope it'll stay like that, even after this talk, which is going to be a little bit different, I guess, maybe different from what you expected. I'd like to start with an epigraph from a chapter called Whereabouts of German Media Theory in the volume Zero Comments by the media philosopher Gerd Loving. In times of globalization, the isolation of cultures inside Europe has drastically risen. In order to address this isolation in the context of posthumanism, I will propose three moves, three sections, two short and one longer one. The first, towards a European posthumanism. In many ways, this talk is a companion piece to a foreword I recently completed for a volume on Italian posthumanism to appear in our Brill series, Critical Posthumanisms, that Rob mentioned later this year. It is, of course, not a defense of some narrow national posthumanist Sonderweg. It is more a gesturing towards what we might call a European posthumanism that, in a sense, lies before us. Before us in the double meaning of before. It is a European posthumanism that hopefully remains still to come, despite many recent setbacks, immunitarian as well as auto-immunitarian reactions to challenges from both outside and inside. At the same time, a certain European posthumanism has already happened. It thus lies before us, contemporaries, and can only be explained by a genealogical approach that tends to traditions, critiques, analyses, processes of self-reflection, rememberings, workings through of European identities as they formed over 2 millennia of violence and strife, but also of undeniable achievements. In the foreword to Italian posthumanism, I follow the outline of a European philosophy Roberto Esposito has been developing since his Living Thought, The Origins and Actuality of Italian Thought in 2012, and A Philosophy for Europe from Outside from 2018. Esposito's genealogical analysis of European philosophy in the late 20th century focuses on three theoretical paradigms and their respective relationships with the outside or with the alterities involved in identity formation. These three paradigms are German critical theory, French poststructuralism, and Italian biopolitical thought. While all three deal with the question of difference, alterity, and identity differently, they can all be said to take place within and deal with the fallout of the crisis of European humanism, a crisis that is both intrinsic to humanism and a reaction to external geopolitical and cultural events, changes, or conditions. Intrinsic because humanism, despite all its best intentions, has failed to keep its moral promises. From outside, so to speak, since its anthropocentrism cannot provide any answers to the rising challenges posed by non-human alterities, both old and new. In times when humanism and anthropocentrism are questioned, only a negative anthropology remained thinkable for a philosophy after Auschwitz, an insight that was felt particularly keenly in post-World War II West German thought. This may therefore also be the starting point to explore with regard to German posthumanism and its specificity. Before that, however, I think we need to establish what a European posthumanism would actually be the critique of. Namely, and this is the second part, posthumanism, the official version. In the scheme of the international global English-speaking and writing theory, English-speaking and writing theory industry driven by Anglo-American publishers and academies, posthumanism is the latest, maybe last, of a series of postisms: postmodernism, postcolonialism, postfeminism, post-Marxism, post-nationalism, post-gender, etc. Each of these posts harbors the deconstruction of its root concept. Posthumanism raises the stakes, since it deconstructs humanism and its concept of the human. Like any discourse, it derives legitimation from explanatory power linked to institutions, practices, ideologies, identities, strategies, and political systems. To simplify greatly, the accepted self-legitimatory narrative of posthumanism seems to discern three phases, which are not necessarily successive, but overlapping. Let's call them cybernetic posthumanism, biopolitical posthumanism, and maybe geopoetical posthumanism. Usually, three female figures are said to be responsible for the posthumanist dynamic. Donna Haraway, who never self-identified as posthumanist, but nevertheless wrote posthumanism's best-known manifesto, the Manifesto for Cyborgs, in 1985. The central metaphor of the cyborg revives the question concerning technology raised by Heidegger for the so-called information society, the rise of cybernetics, and the process of generalized digitalization, a process commented on by Katherine Hayles in How We Became Posthuman in 1999, who links it to a critique of transhumanist fantasies of disembodiment and thus introduces the ambivalent figure of the posthuman. Ambivalent because, on the one hand, the posthuman is what transhumanists wish to achieve by surpassing, transcending the human and its limitations, either through enhancement or replacement by an AI successor species. On the other hand, the posthuman is used as a radical political figure, like Haraway's cyborg before it, and is reclaimed by the third of the triumfeminate of posthumanism's founding figures, Rosi Braidotti. For her, the posthuman becomes the political focus of an ongoing struggle for liberation and resistance in our current posthuman times, or in posthuman age, situated between the fourth industrial revolution and the sixth mass extinction. Haraway subsequently shifted her focus from the cyborg to other biological companion species, especially dogs and more recently critters, which parallels a shift towards an increasingly dominant bio or even micro-biopolitical paradigm within posthumanist thought. Braidotti's work, in addition, also belongs to the third wave of posthumanism, prompted by the ever more prominent discussion of the so-called Anthropocene and the non-human turn. The realization that human-induced climate change has turned at least some parts of humanity into the most important geological actor at a planetary level prompts the most radical phase of what arguably was a fundamentally post-anthropocentric drive behind posthumanism from its beginnings. As a sketch, this will have to suffice. Of course, within this discourse of posthumanism, there is significant conflict and disagreement about political priorities, strategies, constituencies, allies and enemies, methodologies, styles, and so on. As with any discourse, there is an intersection with other competing or complementary discourses like critical animal studies, decolonialism, eco-criticism. However, there are also common enemies. Transhumanism in particular, with its techno-euphoria, with regard to the future achievements of strong AI, bio or geoengineering. While technology remains, of course, an important concern for posthumanism, there is considerable disagreement, however, about its centrality, its autonomy, and its originarity. Just as important, especially for a critical posthumanism, is the question of the animal, of animality and life in general. The great political confrontation here concerns what one might call the construction of the future, connected to the question of the role of science and technology in society, the search for a different form of governmentality, and the extension of agency and subjectivity in the context of a post-anthropocentric understanding of social justice. It is here that the need for a European posthumanism without technology arises, in the form of a challenge to the dominant Anglo-American version of the discourse with its politics of translation and its collusion with neoliberalism. It is a posthumanism without technology, obviously not in a literal sense, but in offering a critique and an alternative to the largely techno-euphoric and techno-salvific discourse that dominates the nexus of neoliberal economic globalization and transhumanist ideology. And equally obviously, it cannot be European in the sense that the European Union operates today, namely as a mainly regulatory and economic body without a proper political project and without a people. It is a Europe that therefore remains to come in Derrida's and also Esposito's sense, one that needs to renegotiate its inside, its outside, and its borders, especially given recent geopolitical developments. It is European, finally, no longer in the classic Kantian cosmopolitan sense, nor in its post-imperialist, post-colonial, post-universalist, provincialized one, but a Europe that remembers, literally, its national and regional multiplicity and its different but converging traditions and values. Which at last brings me to the main part of my topic, the German contribution to a European posthumanism to come. If one were to seek an alternative origin, an alternative trajectory, an alternative idiom to posthumanism in a German context, where would one look? Bracketing the obvious fact that all European philosophy from the 18th century onwards has been influenced by German idealism, from Kant to Hegel to its Nietzschean, Heideggerian and Frankfurt School critiques, two particularly valuable additions to a European posthumanism by a German or German-speaking approach are its 20th century tradition of negative anthropology, and its recent media philosophy. Let's start with the latter, German media philosophy. Here it is to Friedrich Kittler one would definitely have to turn in order to find a specific German take on critical posthumanism. I cannot, of course, provide a detailed introduction to his work and the vast amount of commentary it has received. Kittler is certainly the German media philosopher, and this designation itself is highly problematic, who was most influenced by Lacan and Foucault's anti-humanism, as well as by McLuhan. He was the editor of an iconoclastic volume entitled Austreibung des Geistes aus den Geisteswissenschaften, Programme des Poststructuralismus, 1980, containing essays by Derrida, but also by Samuel Weber and Dietmar Kamper, amongst others, who themselves would have to be considered more closely for any genealogical approach to German posthumanism via poststructuralism. The expulsion of the Geist, the Hegelian spirit, that gives its meaning to history, understood as Geistesgeschichte, and so-called man, its bearer, from the humanistic sciences, opens for Kittler the way to a history of techniques, communication, and media. The media which, and this is Kittler's most famous saying, determine our situation. For Kittler, a focus on communication and media materialities rather than subjectivities and textualities opens up the possibility for the analysis of what he calls cultural techniques, Kulturtechniken, to be read as operative chains composed of actors and technological objects that produce cultural orders and constructs, in the words of Geoffrey Winthrop Young. Neither media nor humans, seen through the lens of cultural techniques, exist as such without the operations and co-emergence of hominization and mediation that cultural techniques provide. In this shift away from human subjectivity towards the cultural technological operations and their historical materialities lies the possibility, according to Geoffrey Winthrop Young, for a post-human cultural studies, or a post-human sociology, according to Nicholas Gain, who was one of the first to see a radical post-humanism at work in Kittler, where human subjectivity is disappearing into the machinery of communication. Bernhard Siegert, in my view, provides the best explanation of the trajectory towards a German posthumanism via media theory. In a short piece on The Map is the Territory in Radical Philosophy, he writes, when the concept of cultural techniques re-emerged in the context of media studies and German Kulturwissenschaft as opposed to British cultural studies, shortly before the turn of the new century, it was based on a post-humanistic understanding of culture. The philosophical specificity of German media analysis, Siegert goes on to say, was that it took up Michel Foucault's concept of the historical a priori and turned it into a technical a priori by referring the Foucauldian archive to media technologies. In a special issue of Theory, Culture and Society in 2013 on cultural techniques, which introduced a number of German media theorists and their commentators to the Anglosphere, Siegert also provides a very neat summary of the difference between Anglo-American and European posthumanism, which is worth quoting at some length. Within the US, the notion of the posthuman emerged from a framework defined by the blurring of boundaries between man and machine. By contrast, French and German posthumanism signaled that the humanities had awakened from their anthropological slumber. This awakening, in turn, called for an anti-hermeneutic posthumanism able to deconstruct humanism as an Occidental transcendental system of meaning production. For the Germans, the means to achieve this goal were media. The guiding question for German media theory, therefore, was not how did we become post-human, but how was the human always already historically mixed with the non-human? But it was not until the new understanding of media led to the focus on cultural techniques that this variant of posthumanism was able to discern affinities with the actor network ideas of Bruno Latour and others. It's a long quotation, I told you. Now, German observers were able to discern that something similar had happened in the early 2000s in the United States, when the advent and merging of critical animal studies and post-cybernetic studies brought about a new understanding of media, as well as the reconceptualization of the posthuman as always already intertwined between human and non-human. I think this is a very, very neat and correct summary. What therefore makes the German discussion on cultural techniques or technology so important now is that it hints at a convergence or a reconvergence with the posthumanist discourse formation more generally, while also providing a genealogical inflection, which makes it critical and, as I would argue, more European. As I can only skim over the surface of the intercontinental translations and returns that are shaping the theoretical paradigm called posthumanism, I have to leave out important aspects like, for example, the role of Niklas Luhmann's systems theory and its reception in the USA, especially for theorists like Bruce Clark and Gary Wolfe, but also for Katherine Hayles and Mark Hansen. Instead, I want to just at least briefly introduce the other aspect that might justify talking of German posthumanism. That these two aspects are connected, cultural techniques and negative anthropology, is again hinted at by Siegert when he says that the study of cultural techniques aims at revealing the operative basis on which ontological philosophical terms like man or the human are founded. Instead, one might argue, there is no man independent from cultural techniques of hominization or anthropotechnics. If cultural techniques deconstruct the anthropocentric idea of man and his Promethean nature, negative anthropology denies the possibility of an affirmative, systematic, or positive definition of the human. It thus echoes Adorno's negative dialectics as the only philosophy remaining after the humanitarian catastrophe of Auschwitz, and as the end of the idea of a humanity, but it also goes back to the very beginnings of anthropology as the investigation into the question, what is man? What is the human? What does it mean to be human? A question maybe as old as humans themselves, and on which one might say all Western metaphysics is based. The underdetermined, open, protean nature of the human species that the neo-Kantian philosophical anthropology, from Scheler to Cassirer, Plessner and Gehlen, takes as its starting point to understand the human Mängelwesen, or the human as nicht festgestelltes Tier, after Nietzsche, leads in the latter half of the 20th century to radically nihilistic and increasingly post-anthropological as well as post-anthropocentric positions in, for example, Günther Anders's Die Antiquiertheit des Menschen, 1956, or Ulrich Sonnemann's Negative Anthropologie, Vorstudien zur Sabotage des Schicksals, 1969. It maybe finds its darkest expression in Ulrich Horstmann's Das Untier, Konturen einer Philosophie der Menschenflucht, 1983, which elaborates on the anthropofugal perception of the human Untier, the non-animal but also the monster, from a post-apocalyptic perspective after its demise and disappearance. If thus the interest in anthropology and its crisis returns in the 20th century and intensifies at the beginning of the 21st century, this, however, does not happen in a humanist sense, but in a new, purely anthropolitical one. What does it mean to be human thus becomes the central question of a posthumanism that is post-anthropocentric, but not entirely post-anthropological. And this predominantly German or German-speaking variant of Kantian philosophical anthropology, which, as the catastrophes of modernity keep accumulating, turns into its opposite, is largely absent from the official Anglo-American account of posthumanism, which also makes it difficult to situate and to receive many of negative anthropology's important contemporary representatives, for example, a Norbert Bolz or even a Peter Sloterdijk, especially his most recent work in anthropotechnics. So where does this leave us? Brief summary. This obviously had to remain a very superficial and broad survey on what I consider the two main ways in which a German posthumanism might supplement the international or global theoretical discursive formation called posthumanism, and which seeks answers to the challenges that the so-called Anthropocene poses. By emphasizing or returning to a number of national intellectual specificities or traditions and reconstructing their specific idiomatic engagements with global challenges, my aim has been to give posthumanism a more European outlook, in the best sense of a Europe to come. In the German context, this could be achieved through a focus on the notion of cultural techniques and their role in the process of hominization framed by a post or negative anthropological understanding of the human. Thank you.